Right guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Just days after Carlos Sainz Sr indicated his intention to take over the presidency of the FIA, the incumbent president Ben Sulayem has issued a series of proposals which, if approved, would only, it seems, serve to consolidate his power to such an extent that he could change the timing of the election and potentially, as a result, even dismiss potential rivals before they even get up to the plate. So many other controversial moments of the day as well. Very much interested to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. Let's begin right about here. High tech. If you guys haven't seen the drama over the last few days, Oliver Oakes was, well, not fired, we believe, but actually stepped down from Alpine. He said, Flavio Briatore said, that it was nothing to do with any personal disagreements, nothing to do with the Jack Doohan, Franco Colapinto situation, but rather Ollie Oakes' brother was arrested over, well, potentially having a load of money that he shouldn't necessarily have. That money may have come from Mr. Mazepin, and that's, Dimitri Mazepin, rather than the son, Nikita. That's because of their involvement in high-tech. The bottom line of this is Russian oligarchs, lots of pushback from Europe after what's happened in Russia and Ukraine over the last couple of years, basically restricted from owning anything in Europe. High-tech, well, is a bit of a grey area, let's just say. And it seems that the team, the Formula 2 team, has turned up to Imola with the truck, but it has nothing on it, right? And as I say, I was at Silverstone yesterday. They've got a high-tech factory just there. There wasn't much activity going on the outside, right? So I don't really know what's going on. Time will tell. Andretti, big updates here. Rumour has it Colton Herta could well be out of the running. Colton Herta, IndyCar driver, worked for that Andretti program, did make a fair bit of sense, but he's had a difficult start to the Indy campaign. I think he's only 9th in the championship right now, and obviously that's not going to be good enough to get a super license either. So it looks like they might be straight away eliminating him from the race. This is Mario Andretti giving his thoughts on it, and he says the choice is actually somewhat limited, mainly because great drivers are under contract, but there are some. The key names going around: Herta, although that may not be the case anymore, Alex Palou, who's currently dominating IndyCar on a level unseen in 60 years before, Mick Schumacher, but also for Palou, you're currently dominating IndyCar. Do you want to go to Formula 1 and drive what's probably going to be a backmarker for the first couple of years? I wouldn't if I was him, to be honest, as much as I'd love to see Palou in Formula 1. Bottas, Mick Schumacher, Zhou Guanyu, we're pretty sure Perez is going to go there. Montoya was talking about it and says that Schumacher's been talking to everyone, and he reckons it's going to be Perez and Zhou. If they do Perez and Zhou, you know what, fair play. They're just accepting the fact they're not going to be great, and they're just going to take the money. And I almost respect it, but it's not who I want to see, really, right? Like, if we're going to have 2 extra spots on the grid, it would be nice for at least one of those spots to go to a driver who we haven't seen in Formula 1 before, for example. Günther Steiner says he thinks it would be Bottas and Perez. That's what he would do, which is nice, but, look, if they're going to sign a Perez, they should bring somebody else in that we've not seen before. That's my opinion. That would be nice, but it may not be what they decide to do. This is Adrian Newey, and another quick Silverstone story for you guys. I somehow, apparently, walked within like a metre of him and didn't even notice. So at the Hilton, I was staying at the Hilton the night before because I was like, I had to do content before getting there in the morning. There was no chance I was getting down there in time for the opening of the museum, the new exhibit. We talked about that last couple of days. But in the Hilton that's on the Silverstone track, apparently Newey was at breakfast. He came for breakfast and he went to sit just on the other side in like a bit of a private bit. And as I was walking to get a glass of orange juice, I saw someone sitting on the other side where they'd kind of barred it off, right? Like because there wasn't enough reason for them to open that other section up because there wasn't enough guests on the day. But I saw someone sitting there and I was like, wow, pretty bold, right? To just go and sit in that private bit. Apparently that was Adrian Newey. And he was there having his breakfast, walking out of the Silverstone factory, because the Aston Martin factory is right there next to the track, and apparently he had come over for a spot of full English, right? So to keep his mind engaged. Thought that was pretty wild. But Adrian Newey is getting ready to go for the 2026 regulations, and actually what he had to say on this is very interesting. So he kind of sat down for pretty much the first time with an interview with the Aston Martin guys 2 months into the project, pretty much after starting at the start of March, and says there is more flexibility for innovation and different approaches than first meets the eye. And this is a very interesting statement from Newey, given what he might be cooking up, right? Because he basically said in 2022, he was concerned that the regulations were so prescriptive, but it turned out when diving into the details, there was more room for maneuver than he initially thought. And we know what happened with Newey and Red Bull in 2022, 23, 24, etc., etc. He says, and there's a similar thing, and he goes on to say at the end of this kind of comment that, look, they have different approaches they are currently targeting Aston Martin. Whether those are the same or different or better or worse than what other teams are doing, that is the question. But that is, of course, the point at the end of the day. So, it was interesting just to see Newey with a little bit of a smirk on his face here. I'll just I'm not going to play the audio, but you guys can read the comments as well that he makes, because you can see that he's got a little bit of a smirk on his face here, saying that initially he thought that 26 was going to be very prescriptive, but he's had the feeling that actually it's more similar to 2022, and there's more opportunities for different approaches than initially meets the eye. So clearly he's cooking up something. Whether it's going to be good or bad, we'll see, but as he says, they've obviously got different avenues to some of the other teams. The big question, of course, really might be around the Honda engines, whether it's going to be good enough next year with all the changes that we are seeing, whether it's still going to be Mercedes dominated. We know that the engine drama is, one of the key dramas around 2026. There are so many. It doesn't, look, AMUS put an article out there saying that one thing that everyone can agree on is that the regulations are poorly written. That's the only thing that people agree on, is the teams are all in agreement that they don't like it. And even Mercedes, they say that no one was a fan of this whole 55-45, or effectively 50-50 power split between the ICE and the hybrids, because the problem with having that is that your electrical motor needs a lot of charging. How are you going to charge it when you can only put so many batteries in the car, and you're going to charge it off a ICE, which is also, developing a similar power? They're also getting rid of, I think, the MGU-H they're getting rid of because it was too complicated. So that makes power recovery even more challenging. Only the MGU-K, the kinetic piece under braking, remains. So, everyone disagrees. Red Bull seem to be of the opinion that they would prefer the main engine produce the normal power, but in a race situation, they want the hybrid elements of the electrical battery to only produce about 65% of the power that it can during a race. That would mean you don't have to deal with so much of the recharging issues, the problems of some cars having no horsepower at the end of a straight, so they've got a downshift at Monza, and all these other things. The issue is if you do mandate that and you say, okay, in qualifying you can use all 1,000 horsepower, but in the race you can only use 800, so you're only using part of the allowance of the electrical engine. Apparently simulations say that car will only be 0.6 a lap slower than a 1,000 horsepower car. That's what rumours say, people that have done the calculations. But other teams say, well, you're only saying that because your electrical component sucks, which may well be true. And even if it's not true, you then have the problem of cars on track in practice who have different power amounts, right? Because if they're doing a quali run, they're going to use the full 1,000 horsepower. If they're doing a race run, they're going to use 800. And that makes things problematic for a track perspective, which means that maybe they would have to mandate certain parts of practice that could be used for race running and used for qualifying sims. But that's just more red tape, right? It's just more regulation on top of an already massively complicated situation. So there are multiple issues. That's one of them. Christian Horner has also been in the news this week because of potentially getting fired. Now, Erik van Haren, who of course is well connected to the Verstappen, says that's been dismissed by insiders. But, who knows, I suppose. The pressure is on Red Bull. In Imola, the team will also come with updates, but not with a huge package, right? So we've talked about this, how big the upgrade in Imola is actually going to be. Reports say that it will be substantial, but not maybe an absolute game changer for the team, like many potentially, especially Verstappen, might be hoping that it could be. I think they are still fundamentally going to be reliant on what's going to happen in Spain with the flexi wing changes. I think Red Bull are still convinced that that needs to go in their favour if they're going to try and win this championship, because upgrades alone simply may not be enough to stop that McLaren. They are going to need to get slowed down. Maybe they will. That's what Red Bull have been trying now for quite some time. Let's talk about the FIA, because once again, the big drama of the day is around this man, Mohammed Ben Sulayem. We saw him in the intro. We'll see him again here in a couple of seconds' time. Now, Ben Sulayem came out on social media a little while ago now and said that he will be making, or at least intends to make adjustments to Appendix B of the International Sporting Code. This, of course, referring to effectively drivers getting fined for swearing and stuff like that, and all of the stuff that's just absolutely outrageous. Now, they are rolling back this to some degree, and look, this is not something to be celebrated, right? First of all, this is not something to be celebrated. I know that people are going to compare this to the fact that Sainz Sr. is now interested in running for presidency. This was in the works before that, so I don't think this specific thing is relevant to Sainz Sr., but what we're going to discuss next almost certainly is. These are the changes they've made. The base fine level has been halved, so wow, great. From 10k down to only 5,000 euros, so that's brilliant. Any misconduct involving the abuse officials changed to a sporting penalty. The officials have the discretion to suspend penalties entirely for first offences. Distinction is they're going to be made between controlled press conferences and uncontrolled environments. So effectively, if it's an uncontrolled environment, you're fine. If it's in a press conference, then you might potentially have an issue. So look, they're rolling this back to some degree. It means that the fines are going to be less. You know, people aren't going to be getting penalties, championship deductions, points deductions, stuff like that for actually swearing at a press conference. Although they do say that any like discriminatory or like racist language or whatever will still be punished very harshly. And what might constitute discriminatory language is, you know, again, right, it's a little bit of a grey. And I don't really think it's going to be a problem, and, you know, the drivers are mostly pretty reasonable. So, you know, it's just one of these things. I think the bottom line is that some people are going to be like, wow, you know, well done, right? Like, great job, FIA. You listen to the criticism. Mostly this is not even from the F1 drivers and the Grand Prix Drivers Association, the GPDA, but this is more from the rally side, because, you know, the rally drivers were literally just walking out of their press conferences to basically protest what they saw as outrageous, that one of their kind of peers got fined 10k or whatever it was for making a word in a press conference. So this is really where that's come from, I think. And okay, they've rolled it back to some extent, but still, it shouldn't be here in the first place, right? Ben Sulayem gets no credit for having introduced these stupid rules and now walked them halfway back and, you know, wants to be congratulated. Like, that's simply not going to work. Another thing that he, well, is not necessarily looking to get congratulated for, but another drama of the day is the following. Now, BBC, Andrew Benson, will take any opportunity that there is to talk about Ben Sulayem, especially if there's some big drama that's happened, and that exactly seems to be what we are seeing here. So, Carlos Sainz Sr. the other day confirmed that he is interested and, you know, presumably qualified. James Vowell said it, others have said it, and look, I would be inclined to agree that yes, there could be some degree of conflict of interest, maybe with Sainz driving for Williams, but it's probably something that can be resolved, and I think that many fans would probably just take anyone competent over what this man is currently doing. That is at least my feeling of the pulse of the Formula One community right now, not just the fans, right, but others as well. This is the article the BBC come out with to describe what is currently happening and the fact that there are proposed revisions to be voted on at a meeting of the FIA General Assembly next month that have been proposed by, you guessed it, the President Ben Sulayem, that appear to further extend his control. Now these, you know, seem to be, on some level, a reaction to the Carlos Sainz Sr. news. That's my read, you guys may disagree. These bring forward the deadline for candidates for December's presidential election, giving Ben Sulayem the possibility to bar any candidate from running against him and allowing him more control over the membership of the FIA Senate. No critic was prepared to comment on record about the changes, as many are bound by NDAs. One said, most proposals aim at some sort of consolidation of power, more centralized control, and trying to eliminate independent checks and balances. Another said the document containing the proposals was very cleverly written. It is taking a moral high ground, or appearing to, whereas the reality of it is probably less so. Ben Sulayem was criticised last December for statute changes that were labelled a worrisome concentration of power by one of its member clubs. Now, this is the detail of what's happening. The most controversial proposal is one that dictates that there must not be anything in the record of the candidates standing for the election as members of the presidential list that calls into question their professional integrity. Now, of course, Ben Sulayem Sulayem is going to say the reason for adding this is because it's currently absent, right? We need to make sure that the candidates are of the utmost integrity. But of course, like, let's be real, how do you actually decide that? So, it says that there should be in requirements for any presidential campaign or any, presidential candidate, let's say, for the sake of consistency, because it applies to candidates standing for a number of other FIA bodies, such as the F1 Cost Cap Committee. So, okay, sure. But the question then is, all right, are there any ethical issues with the candidate? And it would be referred to the FIA Ethics Committee, which are controlled by the president and his allies, following changes to the statutes made by Ben Sulayem. So, you see what we're saying here, right? That the idea of, this is, I think, what that individual meant by cleverly written. Ben Sulayem is saying, oh yes, we must ensure that the candidates are of the utmost integrity, and it will be our ethics committee that determines that, and our ethics committee is now controlled by me. So, you can see where this is going, right? The Code of Ethics dictates that the parties of the FIA shall avoid any conflicts of interest, right? So this is the point, that Ben Sulayem would potentially on this, talking about integrity, be able to say, well, he's the father of Sainz Jr., he races for Williams, therefore no integrity and he should be gone. Now, that doesn't seem reasonable to me, but, you could understand that theoretically the Ethics Committee could bar him from running for the election if this was to go through. So that's really the big deal, and I'm not going to lie, there's more where that came from. So let's keep going through it. Changes to the Senate composition. Ben Sulayem has also proposed changes to the nomination of members. The Senate consists of 16 members, 12 of which are defined in the statutes as representatives of the president, his team and members of the two World Councils for Sports, Mobility and Tourism. The final 4 are currently proposed by the president and confirmed by the other 12 members. Ben Sulayem, though, proposes that actually no, the president should simply appoint these members with no oversight from the other Senate members. And therefore, this is only for good reasons though, right? Because this is just to ensure that there's more flexibility in having the expertise required for many and varied topics it has to deal with, which may require an urgent decision. So, yes, brilliant stuff. I'm sure you can all tell where this is going now. One source close to the situation said this was so clearly poorer governance, the boldness is surprising. A convenient way of dressing it up in a way that I can potentially get rid of these people when it suits me to do so. Other proposals too, to the ethics and other committees. Another change proposes that the 4-year term of office of members of the Audit Committee, Ethics and Nominations, be brought in line with that of the President. So, these terms do not necessarily start at the same time as others on the presidential list. This is to ensure consistency. But a critic says, while this seems efficient, it gives fewer options for dissent outside of a presidential cycle after sacking the head of audit and other ethics committees over the last couple of years after they involved an investigation into him in his office. So, it's all great stuff, isn't it, really, right? Like, if Formula 1 wasn't without a little bit of corruption, where would we be? Changes to the World Council. Ben Sulayem's also proposing to make a change to the composition of the World Motorsport Council. Currently, 21 of the 28 must be of different nationalities, but instead, due to flexibility, there should be no more than 2 members of the same nationality among the 7 vice presidents. The document states this could deprive the FIA of candidates from other backgrounds whose experience and qualities could also be beneficial. But of course, a critic says this allows him to effectively sack who he wants because of this new rule that he wants to bring in. And there's also this one. So, proposal on the election timing. Proposal also brings forward the deadline for candidates, typically 21 days, to up to 49 days, because that means the current time limit leaves the nominations committee with very little time to check the eligibility, because, of course, we want to check the eligibility of their integrity or whatever through the ethics committee and all this type of stuff. Critics say that it could give the president longer to have the nominations committee look at reasons to bar candidates and members of their team. I mean, can you imagine? Like, look, let's be real. All of these points point towards the same idea, right? That potentially Carlos Sainz Sr. trying to come in, and Ben Sulayem is like, well, if I do this and that and something else, it gives me potentially more reasons for me and my team to bar candidates. I mean, it's such an outrageous premise that candidates can just be barred by the ethics committee on grounds of integrity. And let's not forget, the head of the ethics committee, as we mentioned in the article, was fired basically by Ben Sulayem for the investigation into Ben Sulayem and his own ethics. So it really is just a sensational setup we currently have. And, the problem is that the likes of a Sainz Sr., if he was to become the FIA president, would likely resolve many of these situations. I would imagine that he's that type of guy. That's just my feeling, especially compared to our current president. But he may not get the opportunity to even stand based on the drama that we've talked about over the last few minutes here. So, as always, fascinated to hear your thoughts in the comments below. We do return to Imola in a couple of days with all of the governing body drama continually going on in the background. Of course, it's an Italian home Grand Prix, right? A home Grand Prix for Kimi Antonelli, a home Grand Prix technically for AlphaTauri because they're based at Faenza, but mainly, of course, for the Tifosi and Ferrari, Hamilton's first race, a home race with the team. Again, Ferrari were doing social media posts saying like, oh wow, like more history for Hamilton, which is true, but it's like, look, come on, fix the car. Maybe they want to fix the car, but yeah, these are your relevant timings. This is UK time, so work it out from there on the weekends. Practice 2 at 4 tomorrow, or actually Friday, today's Wednesday. Saturday, 3 p.m. quali, Sunday, 2 p.m. race. You guys know the drill. So hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.